Just like that, we're back with Fight Night Picks, and we have the culmination of the Ultimate Fighter Season 31. The lightweights, they are at it, and this was a really, really interesting season for the Ultimate Fighter, because if you didn't watch it, let's break it down a little bit. It was the veterans versus the prospects, and at the first coin toss, Conor McGregor gets his pick, and he picks the prospects. So Chandler gets the veterans, and then Chandler gets the second pick, and he picks the veterans, so McGregor gets the prospects. And ultimately at lightweight, we end up with a couple of veterans, Austin Hubbard and Kurt Holobaugh. And you probably know these fighters quite well. Kurt Holobaugh looking to make it a third time in the UFC like he's Juicy J. Julian Erosa. And for Austin Hubbard, a 3-4 run in the UFC his first time out. And Hubbard was one of those guys, LFA lightweight champ before he came in. He had some memorable fights in the UFC not that long ago. I was actually surprised when I found out that Austin Hubbard was fighting with a regional promotion. I thought he was still around. Didn't even realize that they had cut him quite a while ago, a couple of years ago. And if you look at it for Kurt Holobaugh, he came in off of Strikeforce. He loses to Steven Siler in his first UFC fight at UFC 158. He then strings together 3 fights in the UFC. A fight of the night loss to Raoni Barcelos, where he gets finished in the 3rd round. He drops Shane Burgos with a 4-punch combo, only to dive himself into an armbar, and then he ends up losing a 3rd straight fight against Thiago Moises. So Holobaugh has to pick up the pieces. He wins a couple of fights on the regional scene, but he hadn't fought from 2021 until 2023 in the Ultimate Fighter. So a long layoff for Holobaugh, and on the season of the Ultimate Fighter, Holobaugh first of all draws Team McGregor, and it was a Team McGregor guy out of SBG, Lee Hammond. He's losing until a final Hail Mary, like he's Tim Couch with my Cleveland Browns in 1999, and he lands the submission victory. And so for Holobaugh, he wins that fight. He wins his second fight over there as well. He has an absolute blood and guts war against Jason Knight. But he also beats the piss out of Jason Knight for 2 rounds, and then he ends up getting the TKO win. And for Austin Hubbard, his first fight, he gets a win fairly convincingly. His second fight, he goes out there, wins by split decision against his, roommate or teammate in Roosevelt Roberts. I've never seen a more boring fight in The Ultimate Fighter. Dana White hated it. I thought it looked like a couple of guys that were in a sparring match and didn't want to fight each other.
I think that's a little harsh, but you're not completely wrong. Like, it was not the best fight by any means, but that's the thing about Austin Hubbard. He's not going in there and finishing a lot of fighters, and you even see that in the fights that he had after he had left the UFC, they are both decision wins on his record. And
over who? Just let me bang, bro? Julian Lane?
Exactly. Julian Lane is the first guy that he won over, but you still see the things that kind of got him to the big dance in those decision wins. He has really nice front kicks, and that's the one thing about Austin Hubbard's game that I do really enjoy. He does a good job of at least using the range and using his kicks while at distance before he does start to incorporate his own boxing techniques. And for Hubbard, it is kind of you gotta walk that real fine line, right? Because if he is too far in, other guys are going to be able to outpower punch him if they really do sit down on their shots. But at distance, he can have success in elongated terms of success in the majority of these fights. But the problem with Hubbard has been for the long time, it is that close range. Because if you are that powerful boxer, you're gonna be able to hit him harder than he hits you. And if you can kind of crowd those kicks and start to go for your own takedown attempts, he doesn't necessarily have that second and third note to his game afterwards. And for Kurt Holobaugh, I'm glad you bring up the Shane Burgos drop, because that's the weirdest fight of all time, because it tells you the exact opposite about both fighters that you would assume. Wait, Kurt Holobaugh dropped Shane Burgos and then gets submitted by Shane Burgos off his back? Very uncharacteristic performance from both of those guys, because Holobaugh is a very talented submission grappler when he's able to get the fight to the ground. He does a really good job at going from head and arm chokes into arm bars and whatnot, and it does make you think about not just the initial sequences, but also what's going to come next. But that's why, again, and I know we're going to talk about this, it is really hard to predict a fight like this, because like you had mentioned, Kurt Holobaugh, this would be the 3rd time around in the UFC for him, and rarely, I'm going to bring up Busted Open. It was a show that was on before Luke Thomas on Sirius XM, and I remember there was a grown man on there crying once, because a guy said, well, Ric Flair's a 17-time world champion. Doesn't that mean he lost 16 times? And a grown man got brought to tears because of that fact. That's kind of what you have to say about a guy like Kurt Holobaugh. If he's making his 3rd run in the UFC, unless he is adding some brand new element to his game, I just don't really know where either guy goes from here if they win. It's going to be great. You win the Ultimate Fighter. You get that cool, like, glass trophy thing. But then, is it just going to be the same old Austin Hubbard and the same old Kurt Holobaugh in the UFC afterwards? Because we kind of know how that story ends, don't we?
Well, and that's what we've seen out of Austin Austin Hubbard. It's still real to me, damn it. You watch the first episode, he's taking on Aaron McKenzie, r/MMA Zone. The guy's all over Reddit, and he has been. And in that one, it's defending a lot of takedowns, using his own offensive pressure, getting the back of McKenzie, getting him down, and landing some ground and pound. And from Hubbard in the UFC run, whether it's his fight against Kyle Prepolek, where he loses the first round, but then he rallies in the second and the third, if Hubbard's a better wrestler than his opponent, he wins. If he's a worse wrestler, then he loses. You saw that against Mark Madsen. Even though Hubbard rallied in the third round of that fight, you saw him lose against Davi Hamosh because he wasn't a better grappler. That was in the debut. Hubbard, what we've seen is he's not the fastest on the feet. When it comes to his boxing or his kicks, there's a reset. He's kind of slow. He takes his time. Kurt Holobaugh, even at 36, I think he's a faster fighter. I think he can go out there and land some of his own shots. But Austin Hubbard has that big X factor of the teep kicks to the body. And Hubbard, I saw him check a couple of leg kicks in his fight against McKenzie, in his fight, in his second one out. But that's Roosevelt Roberts. That is a guy in Aaron McKenzie. Against Kurt Holobaugh, you could say the same thing. These two guys combined in the UFC, it's a 3-8 record, so it is a little bit salty. But Hubbard in that fight against Prepolek, that was the one where after the fact he had to go to the hospital, compartment syndrome in his leg, because Hubbard doesn't check any leg kicks, like at all. He will have a little bit of an advantage in just about every single fight, and we know Austin Hubbard's of that class like a Charles Johnson. If every round was a 5-round fight, Austin Hubbard would outlast everybody and win every fight because he's trained at elevation for so long. And he's going to be kind of fortunate because he has a teammate now on this card in Neil Magny that gets to make the trip out to Boston with him. So when it does come down to this one, Holobaugh, you kind of mentioned it, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt in his back pocket. And Holobaugh does have some tidy wins on his record. Outside of the UFC, he beat Des Green for the Titan lightweight strap before losing to Andre Harrison. We're at a point, like, nobody could beat Andre Harrison until he went into the PFL.
Like Goldberg in 1999.
Everybody could beat him, and Holobaugh was on the initial season of The Ultimate Fighter. He beat Matt Bessette, but that one's a no contest because he had a little bit of the IV rehydration after the fact. So when we have a look at this fight, Matt, the finals of the lightweight tournament for The Ultimate Fighter, you've got a guy in Austin Hubbard. We have a look at the Tapology votes. Only 485 of them, 70% Hubbard, 89% by decision for the 30% that have Holobaugh, 52% by decision, 34% by knockout. Both of these guys, I'd say Hubbard, much more difficult to finish out of the two. But when you're trying to make a pick on this one, do you kind of want to edge the younger fighter in the match?
Personally, I do, and I do think it does come down to his ability to go out there and win third rounds. Now, if you lose the first two, it doesn't really matter how good you look in the third if you're not able to get the finish. But Hubbard is one of those fighters, if he was a little bit more heavy-handed, if he had a little bit more pop, he's a bit like Ferricium. Not exactly, but Ferricium, I've always said about him, is it striking really nice to look at? It is. But if he just hit like 15% harder, he'd be that much better. For Hubbard, I know it does help him because he's not throwing everything into every shot, so it does allow his cardio to be so good in that third round, and that's why I am going to pick him in this fight. I think at kicking range, he's going to be able to do enough to at least keep Holobaugh off of him, and I think that'll help him win some of the earlier moments of this fight. And if it does go down the stretch, if there's not a ton of grappling from both guys where Hubbard could get exhausted, I do think he'll be able to win the third, and for that reason, I think he'll get the win.
And we saw Holobaugh, even just on the season, struggle with the takedowns and the pressure of a guy like Lee Hammond, and Holobaugh's traditionally struggled with wrestling defense. So if Hubbard goes in there and goes for the takedowns quickly, he could find himself in some pretty advantageous positions because he keeps things pretty darn tight when he is on the mat. I like Holobaugh, though, with the activity. I think his striking is going to be a difference maker. Once they get into a phone booth, Holobaugh, I perceive, has an advantage there. So we're splitting the pick in this one, and I'd really be eager to hear who the fans have. A couple of UFC vets here battling it out for the Ultimate Fighter trophy. Hubbard versus Holobaugh. Let us know who you have in the comments section. We have some big time fights left on this card. 2 title fights up at the top. You're not going to want to miss any of it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.